HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Blind Spot Effect: How to Stop Missing What's Right in Front of You by Kelly Boys, read by Coleen Marlo. Introduction. I'm here to be me, which is taking a great deal longer than I had hoped. Anne Lamott. Ever since I was a girl, I wanted to work in prisons. Not with the psychopaths. That is beyond my pay grade. But your run-of-the-mill felon feels like family to me. The kind of family you don't know what to do with. But you recognize that in some way they never got what they needed. And if they could have a taste of it, you see the possibility of change and a new life. My favorite thing about going into San Quentin State Prison, where I spent a few years teaching a weekly meditation class, was the kinship I shared with the people inside. As I walked across the prison yard among inmates jogging the track or crouched along the concrete perimeter in the California sun, I felt a sense of heightened alertness, but I was not scared to be there. That's because I have been on the receiving end of violence and have first-hand experience with its dimensions and contours, which we all carry in some form inside ourselves, whether it's acted upon or not. And I know I can show up with a fierce heart and compassionate boundaries. Some of these prisoners were the hyperbolic and unfortunate perpetrators of that shadow of hatred and anger, and some were the reflection of a racially divided, punitive system serving the privileged and punishing the innocent. Most of the folks I worked with, lifers with the possibility of parole, were incarcerated for acting out of a blind spot. Often, the consequences were deadly. Most of the inmates I spoke with shared that the act that brought them to prison happened in mere seconds, with almost no forethought. When I asked a large circle of men to add up the length of their sentences, it totaled hundreds of years. The crimes that got them there? The total was minutes. I've always had a knack for finding blind spots, the stuff we can't see about ourselves that has an impact on everyone we encounter. These hidden parts that drive us can be transformative in their revelation. I'm drawn to discovering, exploring, and even flailing around in my own and other people's blind spots, because I've always been curious about how we cannot see something that may be blatantly, and at times painfully obvious to others. Blind spots, as I define them, are unconscious impulses, fueled by emotions and beliefs, that create habit-building patterns in relationship to ourselves and others. For instance, an inmate who can't quite understand how his self-victimizing behavior keeps landing him behind bars and always blames someone else. Or an insecure person who talks too much and too fast so that everyone he meets thinks, wow, this dude is trying to prove something. When's he going to be quiet? Blind spots are tricky because we can't see them. Their nature is to hide in plain sight. They may lead us to feel depressed or misunderstood, to unknowingly alienate those we love, or to not recognize our own value and power. Blind spots start wars and break up families. They foster disconnection and isolation at home and at work. They hold us back or force us into places we never wanted to be. We may think they're having minor or negligible impacts on our lives, but those impacts add up, keeping us from being fully happy, alive, and creative. Blind spots are not the things we already know about ourselves that we are working on, like being more patient with our children or more confident in social situations. Blind spots are not abstract ideas. They are ingrained beliefs and attendant emotions that drive us to play out patterns we don't see, all to avoid the obvious that is right in front of us. Who hasn't failed at something or been shocked by someone's behavior and asked themselves, how did I not see this coming? Blind spots can make messes of our lives, yet they also reveal important messages if we are open to examining them. Even when the thing we're discovering is embarrassing or feels shameful, the act of seeing it can be life-changing, especially when we see it along with trusted friends or within a safe context for learning and growth. Seeing blind spots is like a treasure hunt, but not a witch hunt. If we approach the subject with curiosity and affection, rather than shaming ourselves, we can discover some immensely valuable truths. It was the revelation of my own blind spots that led me to write this book. I've been studying the human condition like a scientist, albeit imprecisely, for 2 decades. I've taught meditation and emotional intelligence, not only in prisons, but in a variety of places, including veterans' hospitals, the Google campus, United Nations agencies, and on the front lines of conflict in the Middle East. I've come to realize that cinder-block prison walls, Silicon Valley corporate walls, and the walls of refugees' tents have a lot in common. They all hold passionate, vulnerable human beings who want to have their basic needs met, to be loved and accepted by their families and communities, and to share their gifts with the world. They also hold people who are trying to get ahead, even when that means trying, at times desperately, to portray and defend a false image of themselves, an image they are blind to, in order to not be attacked, blamed, or judged. If you think about it, what do we all want deep down? Dr. Richard Miller, psychologist and founder of the Integrative Restoration Institute, once told me, "Every single person who has come into my office for the past 30 years has come here asking different forms of the same fundamental question. Am I okay? Can you tell me that I'm okay?" What we share is a natural drive for acceptance and love. We are compelled to ask the world to reflect our worthiness back to us as a way of escaping from what is smack dab in front of our faces. Our own discomfort in the form of unworthiness, shame, doubt, vulnerability, and all the ways we don't love and accept ourselves as we are. I've discovered that each of us has at least a few wacky and creative ways of going about getting these needs met. There is nothing wrong with such strategies per se, but the related behaviors can be created and maintained by blind spots. Blind spots that are obvious to others while we, oblivious, coast through life never finding what we're looking for and leaving a wake of unmet needs behind us. Nobody is exempt. Here's how I discovered a blind spot of my own. I was sitting in a session with a therapist named Paul on a well-used couch in the trendy Mission District of San Francisco, staring at the antique toy fire trucks placed along his windowsill and balancing a glass of water in my lap. A friend had suggested that, just maybe, therapy would be a helpful thing for me to do. I was out of work and ending a relationship, and although I trusted that things were going to turn out okay, I was a bit at sea. Paul listened to a synopsis of my entire life, including a short foray into my Ohio childhood, my marriage at 18 and divorce at 21, and a quick trip through 20 years in Germany, Japan, Canada, and England, culminating in the Sausalito, California cafe where I thought I was going out for a coffee and ended up getting fired. Then he studied me through his tortoiseshell-framed glasses and asked, "Do you want to look at your blind spot, or do you want to let these patterns repeat?" Boom! That was it. That was the question that changed everything for me. I spoke from the depths of my being, and with trepidation and an unsuppressed laugh when I replied, "Yes, hell yes." In that moment, I was ready to hear my therapist's words. When you've been on the receiving end of random, difficult, or sometimes horrible life events, you develop a bullshit detector for people who blame the victim. This was not that. This was an honest and genuine question pointing out my own participation in my life patterns. I was undefended and ready to learn something new, ready to grow. I trusted that shining a light on my blind spots would be good and productive, although probably painful. Up until that moment, I had taken a random and fateful approach to the happenings and events in my life. Shit happens, good stuff happens, and it's how you navigate it all that matters. I had never thought of my hidden traits in this way before, so pointedly, urgently, and globally. I'd done plenty of work on my emotional life, like setting free self-limiting beliefs and getting in touch with self-compassion and self-trust through mindfulness meditation. But none of this had revealed Paul's insight that something I wasn't seeing at all, a blind spot, was driving my behavior. He helped me recognize that what I was missing was just past the edge of my own perceptual horizon. Realizing that this stuff was obvious to someone I just met, stuff that had been entirely out of view to me, woke me up. What had I been missing? What I discovered, with Paul's gentle nudging, was that my biggest blind spot had to do with accommodating other people's blind spots. I had protected certain important people in my life from the impact of their own unconscious behavior. That is, until I finally couldn't take it anymore and blurted out their blind spots. That's where the trouble happened. My unexpected and uncharacteristic speaking of the truth rarely went over well. In fact, it's how I ended up in that coffee shop in Sausalito, shocked when I was let go for my job. I know I'm not alone. Why is it that so many of us often suffer for no clear reason? What are the patterns, especially those we can't perceive, that interrupt our healthy and sane functioning? Why are we all trying so darn hard to defend our ideas, self-images, and opinions, even when doing so hurts us and the people around us? What is at stake here? It turns out that everything is at stake. We are biologically wired for survival, and as humans, we have developed a belief that our survival is contingent upon this thing called me at the center of our world. To sustain our sense of self, get the love we want, and succeed in our vocations, we engineer all kinds of crafty ways to keep our self-image not only intact, but impervious to attack. There's nothing wrong with that. It's natural. Except that it's also not natural because we're defending an idea instead of something real. To make matters even more interesting, we develop lifelong beliefs that keep us from seeing any of this, including those beliefs. If what we want is to be accepted and loved, and to flourish, this doesn't work. What if seeing our blind spots could radically transform the way we live, work, and perceive reality? Have you ever looked at an optical illusion and been startled or scared to discover what your brain does to make sense of what you're seeing? For instance, you see a gray box even though it's actually white because of how it's positioned on a checkered background. Or you see a triangle in a diagram where there isn't one because of strategically placed wedges and angles. Optical illusions point to how easy it is to fill in what we see based on memory, the biology of vision, and our brain's need for coherence. And they reveal how much our minds can trick us. Because we perceive the world with relative accuracy most of the time, we're surprised when we get duped. We believe that our senses are exact, so it shocks us when we find out that is not the case. It's the same with uncovering blind spots, and there lies the possibility for life-changing insights to appear. Something I'll refer to later in this book as well is a visual phenomenon called attentional blink, a momentary blindness that causes us to miss an object in our field of vision. Not only do our unconscious processes make us see things that aren't there, as optical illusions reveal, but we also blink out on what is there. Not that we should see everything, that would be a nightmare. Doesn't it make you wonder, though, with all this blindness, our unconscious beliefs and driving emotions, and even what we miss and make up visually, how do we know which things are worth seeing, and if they even should be seen? Is it possible to illuminate something we are missing that will not only help us be more insightful, but perceive ourselves and the world around us in a whole new way? Our attention may be our most valuable human resource, and it's something that our inner processes and the world around us compete for. Think of how much money is spent on marketing and advertising, on gaining and sustaining our attention. The more overstimulated we get, the more fragmented and partial our attention becomes, pulled in 1,000 directions and going in none, and we end up blinking past what is most important, sometimes even if it's right in front of our eyes. If we were to see more that is right in front of us and within us, would it contribute to the sensory overload we already experience? My theory is that if we illuminate the right things at the right time, they can reduce the noise or stimulation in our minds and help us navigate life. When we see something important that we missed, or we stop seeing something that's not there, we gain access to those aspects of power, truth, and authenticity that we have pushed down in favor of the status quo. That's when we begin to align with the natural current of life, rather than resisting it. We get unstuck. Often, self-improvement paths we embark on to find our purpose, or live life fully, can be like getting on a hamster wheel that goes nowhere. Such things can be useful, but can also be too focused on an unreachable perfection or idealized destination rather than on each step and the moment of the journey. Important: seeking out blind spots is not a self-improvement project. It's a conversation and process that brings us important perceptions and understanding of the beautiful mess of our lives, not an idealized state. And it's precisely that beautiful mess that holds our happiness. The purpose of this book is to help you to stop missing what's right before your eyes, uncover your blind spots, and free up energy for your life. More than that, I'd love for this book to shine a light on what we all have in common. Facing our own fallibilities makes it easier to understand those of others. Opening to our vulnerable and caring heart amid life's challenges can ease the sense of separation and heal our inner and outer conflict, bringing us closer to those we love most. The world is in desperate need of a next step, a different way to approach the same old problems. I believe one of the best things we can do is to illuminate what keeps us from being close to ourselves and close to each other, and to stand together in diverse communities and reclaim the ways in which we have allowed bias, reactivity, and the defense of illusions to divide us. We all have blind spots. We all know people with blind spots, and we are all in this together. 1. Attentional blink. What we miss and how we miss it. Attention, if sudden and close, graduates into surprise, and this into astonishment, and this into stupefied amazement. Charles Darwin, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. The elephant in the room. Most of us are familiar with the expression, the elephant in the room. It refers to something that is obvious to everyone in that room, yet unaddressed between them, often because there are cultural or social taboos around speaking directly to it. Like when we're riding the subway and a ranting drunk person stumbles onto the train and everyone pretends they don't notice him. We have all done this. Often the elephant in the room remains exactly what it is, seen but unacknowledged, because we know there will be some sort of challenge to face if we name it. Since we're sometimes unprepared to deal with that challenge, it can be easier to leave the elephant in the pretend shadow, and in fact, sometimes that's the wisest response. But have you ever stopped to think that you may be avoiding your own elephant? That you may have a blind spot that is obvious to everyone in the room except you? Your response may be to say to yourself, I've never thought of that. I'm horrified at the possibility that I'm missing something so obvious to everyone else. Or you may be thinking, I don't have any big blind spots, but I sure know a lot of people who do. Either way, this book is for you. Uncovering our blind spots means that what we have completely or mostly not seen, not known, or not experienced suddenly appears before our eyes like a huge, clumsy, at times, graceful, at times, elephant. That's why we hire psychotherapists, read self-help books, take leadership classes, or ask close friends to be honest with us, so we can focus on the gigantic, noisy, large-eared mammals standing directly in front of us that we somehow manage not to see at all. Interestingly, it doesn't always seem like a full-sized elephant when we do discover it. It can still be a little hazy or obscured. It can take time to see and understand the fullness of the space our blind spots occupy and the impact they have. But they can be painfully or gloriously obvious to others. That's the twist. Our blind spot can be clear as day to our loved ones or colleagues, but it might take some time for us to fully understand that it's there, and to see its enormity and its consequences, manifesting as the ways we relate to and influence ourselves and the world around us. Hallucinations. The simple act of seeing what's there, of finding blind spots, can only happen when our attention is available and we're not lost in our stories and ideas or on autopilot. Doing things like continually pushing our agenda during meetings without listening to feedback and then wondering why productivity is slow, or not seeing how our constant busyness distances us from our children, or how our insecurity drives us to keep secrets from our partner. All of these result in a lack of intimacy and connection. Hallucinations are what neuroscientist Anil Seth says our brain creates when what we perceive doesn't match what is really there. A professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex in England, Seth researches the nature of perception and conscious experience. He studies the brain as a prediction machine, how it combines prior beliefs and expectations with sensory input to come up with its best guesses about what we sense and experience, internally and externally. If you think about it, human beings have extraordinary capacities to perceive the world and interpret it. Seth's framework of hallucinations connects to the mechanisms behind blind spots, how we sometimes don't see what's there, but instead what we expect to be there, and how that doesn't always coincide with reality. When reality and our expectations match, there's no dissonance. But when they don't match, what do we do? If we prefer our expectations over what we actually experience, we see what we want to see and miss what is there. That is the point where we go blind. In other words, we hallucinate when we allow sensory signals to be blocked by the script in our heads, by what we expect and predict. These hallucinations serve to form core beliefs about ourselves and the world around us that run in the background our whole lives and drive our blinded behavior. What if a huge part of your personality or idea of yourself was based on this kind of a blind spot? Wouldn't you want to find that out? That's what makes searching for our blind spots so intriguing. We all have varying levels of self-awareness and can examine that awareness across the spectrum. One end being emotional intelligence, aware of our inner body sensations, emotions, thoughts, and able to act from learned wisdom. And the other end being cut off from and clueless about what's going on inside and around us. Depending on how in touch we are with our inner and outer environment, we can miss a whole lot. Think of someone you know who's highly emotionally intelligent, someone you learn things from just by being around them. And then think of someone who is so out of touch with themselves that they tend to bring discomfort or suffering to everyone they meet. That is the spectrum. We have predictive brains that are constantly guessing at what we are perceiving, and the level of our emotional intelligence depends on how correct those guesses are. In some ways, we're like computer algorithms, simpler than our complex environments, yet always learning based on new input. To develop self-awareness, the type of data we take in matters, as does the way we approach it. That's why one person can listen to their team at work and find creative ways to solve complex problems, while another keeps repeating an inefficient strategy born out of a hallucination that they have the solution and everyone else needs to shut up and follow their orders. The two people are sorting and processing information in different ways, and they may have radically different stories and interpretations of the same problem, which leads to a huge gap in the outcome. In other words, how sophisticated our learning is depends on how we take in information. We form mental blind spots when we get stuck in a hallucination, in seeing what's not there or in missing what is right in front of us. Optical illusions illustrate that our minds can create something from nothing visually, but this also applies to ideas and beliefs. So the manager who is convinced that his way is correct is missing the fact that the whole team is upset and disengaged because he is seeing something that is not actually there. His infallibility and their ignorance. These sorts of work scenarios are laborious, stressful, and inefficient. But we can learn to learn better when we develop awareness of our brain's tendency to predict what we expect and hold our own views more lightly, allowing ourselves to be wrong and fallible sometimes. This creates bandwidth for increased curiosity and self-awareness, as well as more meaningful relationships. Physical blind spots. Blind spots don't exist only in our minds. If you've ever driven a car, you know that blind spots are actual obscurations in the visual field. We have physical blind spots on our eyes, too, called punctum cecum in medical literature, an area on our retina that can't detect light because it doesn't have the photoreceptor cells to do so. It's the tiny place where the optic nerve passes into the optic disc. As a result, the corresponding part of the field of vision is invisible to us. We still see what is in front of us without seeing a blank spot in our field of vision. The gap gets filled in by surrounding detail, and we don't even know there's something we are missing. Interestingly, the octopus is the only creature that has no blind spots due to the placement of its retinal nerve fibers. They don't block light coming in, so the octopus sees everything in front of itself. I like the fact that our blind spots have a literal corollary, but for better or worse, we're not octopuses. The purpose our physical blind spots serve is to allow us to see everything else in our field of vision. It is in this way that we can acknowledge the importance of blind spots and their function in helping us see. The same goes for our psychology and how we engage our world. The light is blocked and we miss stuff. These obscurations were often created when we were young, to help us see other important stuff and to survive and get by okay. Just as our physical blind spot means we need to rely on surrounding detail to see the world, our psychological ones helped us navigate life when we were too young to see the whole of our experience. When we're children, we often don't have the tools to cope with the fact that our needs for acceptance, safety, and love aren't getting met, in ways large or small. So we develop creative mechanisms to overlook the hurt and seek out other strategies and behaviors to try to fill our needs. Denial can be a good thing when we're under stress and don't have the tools to cope with our experience. But it's not great when it becomes a habit. It creates a breeding ground for blind spots. And if we don't see them, they can hang around for our whole lives, driving our behavior without our knowledge. The good news about psychological blind spots is that we can bring them into the light, creating the attentional equivalent of photoreceptor cells where we didn't have them before, coaxing our blind spots out of the shadows and into view. Once we recognize our blind spots, we can't unsee them again. They're no longer hidden. We're no longer blind. We've awakened from the hallucination and can see the elephant in the room. If we know how to mine them for their gifts, we then have a chance to discover their hidden messages and learn and grow. Blind spots, then, aren't bad things about ourselves, but are instead helpful puzzle pieces of information in our field of awareness that, when seen, offer a fuller view of what is accurately there. We can learn to perceive light where there is shadow, that is, if we're brave or crazy enough. Attentional blink. The main reason we don't see the elephant in the room is that there is a gap between what we experience consciously and unconsciously. These gaps on the spectrum of self-awareness are places where our attention blinks out. Like when we're talking on the cell phone while driving and miss an exit on the freeway, or when we thoughtlessly delete a calendar notification and miss a meeting. We all miss stuff, especially the stuff that lurks beneath the surface of our conscious awareness. Attention helps us sort, process, and choose what is important and interesting in our environment, and allows us to omit what is irrelevant. It's hard to focus on more than one thing at a time, even though we like to think of ourselves as good multitaskers. Attentional blink is a scientific term for the distance or interval in time, often just a flash, that occurs when our attention moves from one thing to another. It describes what we miss, and is a phenomenon based on research about the brain resources we mobilize or have available to us to catch or miss information related to the visual field. In the same way that we hallucinate and filter the world through stories that aren't real, we also miss actual physical objects that are right in front of us because our attention is elsewhere, like on that trip we were going to take when we retire, or the fight we just had with our partner, or something we just saw out of the corner of our eye. Attentional blink reveals that beyond our physical blind spot in our retina, we miss actual things in our environment that we could see, were our attention freed up to notice it and were it to seem relevant enough to us to remember. In the 1990s, 3 researchers from the University of Calgary, Jane Raymond, Kimran Shapiro, and Karen Arnell, developed a series of research experiments to test whether people could visually process 2 letters in a row if one was presented between 180 and 450 milliseconds after the other within a rapidly shown sequence of letters on a computer screen. In one of the experiments, the first letter was a white T, and the second was a black X, and the researchers called them both targets. Raymond and her cohort found that the subjects often did not detect the black X. Since then, there have been many studies examining the nature and possible causes of attentional blink. just what was happening during the 180 to 450 millisecond gap. The subject's attention wasn't freed up to see the second letter.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?